In today's multipolar world, we require a new narrative to address the ever-growing socio-political challenges that pose threats and opportunities of various forms. To reach this goal, the international community is more than ever called upon to come together to make a strong statement against any form of threats that weaken human rights, the fabric that constitutes democracy, the rule of law, and the fundamental values which are enshrined in the Universal Charter of Human Rights. These achievements were attained after decades of conflicts and bloodshed, which above all served to teach humanity a fundamental lesson, that war is not a solution to settle differences. These landmark achievements of mankind also manifest that there are other routes to be followed if one is to achieve long-lasting peace. International law hosts a repository of experiences and practices that constitute the backbone of every civilization, thus purporting specific laws to render the taking of decisions more homogeneous with the spirit of what is right and what is by default unlawful. As Francis Bacon propounded, and I quote, "Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind," unquote. Change may take the form of ideologies that inspire whole generations to move ahead in any one particular direction, as well as prove conducive to a status quo, which hinders progress from taking its course. This has been the case with a good number of authoritarian regimes and totalitarian methods of governance. Enabling people to take full participation in decision-making is by far the optimal way to lay the ground for an inclusive society, where everyone is expected to contribute in the building of a democracy and what this represents. Indeed, as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, it suffices to mention that in the aftermath of the Great War, the League of Nations was established to maintain order and inject new blood in a still war-torn world, which not only was deprived from its human demeanor through the loss of millions of lives, but also led to deep economic and social depression, the effects of which were long-lasting. This undoubtedly touched upon the social fabric of a post-war Europe and saw the emergence of new states within its fold and the presence of many ethnic communities and minorities prowled within its borders. This warranted both the recognition of inherent cultural dynamic, which connected disparaging groups through European Convention, as well as led to a greater awareness of the need to safeguard the interests of minorities. This led to the Menorahs Treaties, an alliance which could be perceived as having been adopted by states on becoming members of the League of Nations and the United Nations respectively, and which entered into force through the Versailles Peace Conference. Unfortunately, this attempt at conferring basic rights on all inhabitants of any one country without distinction of birth, nationality, language, race, and religion fell short from being respected by governments, and although the entire system collapsed in the 1930s, the treaties remained the basis of international law. The interwar period led to an increased convocation of the urgency to reinforce what has been initiated with the League of Nations. Indeed, at the same time, other initiatives took place with the intention to strengthen the rights of individuals, as when in 1919, the International Labour Organization was established to safeguard the interests of workers. This was a time when the advent of industrialization was already shimmering on the horizon, giving way to the creation of trade unions, which continue to mount pressure on governments to give workers their due. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 led to a serious rethinking of what human rights really entails. While there was homegrown sentiment that human rights were just a Wilsonian idea, which could never take root in domestic legislation, on the other hand, the atrocities of World War II left their unswerving remark to a point that in April 1945, 50 countries met in San Francisco to establish an international body that would reflect the aspirations of its members in promoting peace and order. Indeed, the Charter establishing the United Nations enshrined a set of principles which put the human person at the center, thus bringing to a significant end a long course which, since the days of Westphalia, resolved to eradicate slavery and give dignity to each and every human being, wherever, whoever he or she may be. The United Nations Charter can be described as a hymn for peace and the eradication of war. It is an outcry which echoes centuries of turmoil and malcontent, and which, unfortunately, up to this day, we still have difficulty to abide with and honor. 1948 was the year when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was formulated by a commission established purposely under the dynamic chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt. The Magna Carta was drawn up in the 2 years following the Nuremberg trials, which had established an important principle in the narrative of the evolution of human rights. That is, individuals have responsibilities and obligations under international law. In this regard, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, while reconfirming the outcome of the Nuremberg convocations, went on to proclaim them as inherent values that constitute human dignity and which give rise to a civilization built on respect, tolerance, and the overreaching principle of freedom. Indeed, we have come a long way since the historic rendering of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Since then, the world has changed rapidly, and many democracies across the globe adopted the Declaration as part of their constitutional law. Human rights are still the subject of controversy in many countries, as people continue to be deprived of their right to freedom and the dignity to live in peace. Referring back to history, after the establishment of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it was considered appropriate to enact a Covenant on Human Rights, thus ensuring that principles enshrined in the former will be legally binding on states. Unfortunately, as soon as the Commission started to work on this important development, human rights fell prey to the Cold War, with the Western Bloc giving preference to civil and political rights, while the Communist Bloc insisted on the primacy of economic, social, and cultural rights. It was again an issue of ideologies that saw the world through different lenses and acted accordingly. This political rivalry led to a split of the original covenant. We have two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the other International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In the course of the last half a century, the United Nations kept human rights at the top of its agenda, paving the way for several treaties and conventions dealing with specific human rights issues. The United Nations sought to provide legal protection for individuals suffering racial and gender discrimination, torture, as well as for specific categories of persons, inter alia, women and children. The length and breadth of human rights and human rights action are limitless. We all agree that unless we continue to draw pointers that address the breaching of this right, we risk falling short of anticipating crises of multiple forms, such as, but not only, migration, which is often the result of conflict, economic problems, as well as persecution of minorities in their homeland. At a time when we managed to bring down geographical borders for smoother mobility of goods and people and enable the former to interact better through digital means, we still face stark challenges that hinder many from exerting their right to live in dignity. In Europe, for example, there is an estimate of 25 million unemployed people, whereas the amount of people living with less than $5 per day in Europe and Central Asia amounts to around 80 million. Something has definitely gone wrong. In the late 1970s, as democracies more than doubled, political analysts like Samuel Huntington coined the unfolding process as the third wave of democratization. Indeed, there was an apt optimism that once democracy became contagious, there will be no looking back. Unfortunately, many third-wave democratic transitions fade dismally, giving way to sad aftermaths which did little or nothing to restore the once established democracy as it was before. On the other hand, the once triumphant Western democracies soon met their own fate when they experienced unprecedented economic crisis, which crippled their democratic system, giving way to a specter of popular skepticism and mistrust. Inasmuch as they are personal, human rights represent the popular expression that goes beyond geographic borders, race, gender, and belief. The effectiveness of human rights affects the very foundation of a country's economy, its affluence in educating and training its people, as well as gives a way to the right environment for employment and prosperity to grow. Detaching human rights from the overreaching purpose is like detaching a child from its mother. The establishment of the International Court of Justice in 1945, which gave life to the Hague Conventions in the late 19th and 20th centuries, is an important development in the route perpetuated by the Nuremberg trials, which emphasized the notions of duties and responsibilities towards others. In fact, the International Court of Justice expanded this notion to two main areas of competence, namely contentious interstate cases, which the parties concerned consent to before it and provide, and also provides advisory opinions sought by certain United Nations bodies on matters of legal concern. Whilst it is not possible to enter into the details of this important institution, it suffices to remark that by the late 1990s, approximately 400 bilateral and multilateral treaties were deposited at the United Nations, conferring compulsory jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice. Indeed, I fully agree with Dr. Sutter, Keith Sutters of Global Directions, who has explained that, and I quote, "There should be a campaign to encourage governments to accept the ICJ's compulsory jurisdiction. This should be part of a general concern by citizens in expecting a better standard of international behavior from their governments. There needs to be a general monitoring system by NGOs on how governments are living up to or failing to living up to their international obligations." Unquote. May all the governments which have to this day not taken up this call to accept the ICJ's compulsory jurisdiction and move in this direction in the best interest of their sovereign countries and the peoples they represent. The same applies to a distinct but equally important development that took shape in 1998 in the form of the Criminal Court of Justice. The court, which started operating in 2003, was meant to try individuals who have committed crimes in the form of genocide against humanity and war crimes. As a country with centuries of old juridical tradition, my country, Malta, always sought to serve as a catalyst in promoting and safeguarding human rights in the Mediterranean region and beyond. Malta immediately transposed into its legislation a legislative framework of the provisions of the Kampala Agreement, which sought to extend the ICC's jurisdiction over crimes of aggression. As I could well attest in my tenure as the head of the Malta Sanctions Monitoring Board, Malta enforced sanctions imposed by the United Nations without losing sight of the ultimate objectives of sanctions: the promotion of peace, the preservation of liberty and freedom, and the reverence to the dignity of the individual, unthreatened by strife and conflict. Moreover, being fully aware of the crises that have been impinging on the stability and the well-being of the people in the region, Malta is proud to host the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law. The Institute will collaborate with the United Nations and other international and non-governmental organizations and is aimed to provide rule of law-based training to lawmakers, police, prosecutors, judges, correction officials, and other sector stakeholders dealing with legal matters. The Institute will offer a unique platform to develop and deliver the comprehensive, integrated, and sustainable training required to address 21st century transnational threats most effectively. The Institute will play a central role in our collective effort to support countries in North, West, and East Africa and the Middle East as they turn the page on an old approaches that sometimes were defined by extreme focus on regime security and repression. The Institute will teach adherence to the rule of law and protection of the security and liberty of people whose governments are meant to serve. The institution will serve as a training center dedicated to strengthen criminal justice and other rule of law institutions, promoting regional, judicial, and police cooperation, and fostering regional criminal justice practitioner networks to allow countries to provide security and liberty to their citizens based on the respect for human rights and the rule of law. I end my address to you here today by citing Nelson Mandela's words of wisdom, and I quote, "To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity," unquote. May we all remain vigilant in the wake of any threats that could hamper our hard-earned achievements towards securing human rights for all, as well as ensuring that all people of goodwill continue to dwell in peace as they acknowledge their different cultures in a spirit of fraternity that transforms insulation into cooperation and detachment into vibrant civilizations that last. Thank you very much.